My concern is what is in the best interest of Africa and African countries. And I thought I should provide a perspective in terms of China and the relationship between China and Africa. So I wanted to structure my thoughts under 3 headings. One of them is, the first one is what I call the inadequacy of Africa's previous relationships. And then the second one is the suitability of China as a partner for Africa. And third, going forward, what next? So China doesn't just show up in Africa, right? I mean, China doesn't show up in Africa in a vacuum. Here's what was happening. Throughout the 90s, if you were to ask people, anybody who remembers or who was old enough to remember what happened in Africa in the 90s, you would know that in the 90s, Africa was a place of, the first things that were happening on the continent in the 90s were wars, a lot of civil wars, Black Hawk Down, the Rwandan genocide, the Liberian Civil War, the Sierra Leonean Civil War, what was called Africa's World War, when Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Uganda fought in the Democratic Republic of Congo with different rebels there. And so with all of these wars happening across the continent, then they precipitated humanitarian disasters. You have huge numbers of internally displaced people, and you have had refugees. I too was a refugee during the war. I finished high school in a refugee camp in Cote d'Ivoire. So this is one of the things that was happening in Africa in the 90s, a lot of wars. And those wars were in part funneled, driven by what had happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Light weapons became easily available, and enterprising people sold arms to rebel groups across the continent, and so you had wars. And with the wars, like I said, you have significant humanitarian crisis, but that wasn't the only thing. There was a huge disease burden. HIV/AIDS, if you remember, throughout the 90s and the early aughts, was ravaging the continent. Central and Southern Africa were being wiped out. You had entire villages where there were 2 generations with a missing generation. You had the grandparents and the children, and the entire generation of parents were wiped out. So you had that. You had malaria. You had all of the tropical diseases you can think about. Those were happening. So it was not just the wars that were ravaging the continent. It was also the disease burden. Then something came back to bite us. A lot of African countries had taken out significant debt in the 70s, and that debt then came due. And so we came to an instance where most African countries were spending up to 60% of government revenues on just simply servicing debt. And in some instances, it was just interest, not even the, and because for years they had not serviced the debt, they accrued punitive interest and punitive charges. And so, let's go back, you had wars, disease, debt. Within this context, very few companies, very few in the West, looked at Africa as a place to do business. Most of Western policy toward Africa was actually filtered through the lens of development and aid. This was the picture of what was happening in Africa in the year 2000, when China hosted the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. And the FOCAC was held in Beijing. 40 African heads of states and governments were invited. And 2000 happened to be a very fortuitous year, because that was the year that China first did its going out policy, when Chinese firms were encouraged to go out to seek access to resources, but to seek access to markets. So when everyone else, and everyone else, I mean the West, saw Africa mainly through the lens of development aid, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, there was still, the Chinese actually saw an opportunity to do business. So Chinese companies go out into Africa. Now, why? Right? At this time, something else was happening. I mean, globalization is actually taking off. And we know what happened. Well, I have an argument of what happened. I mean, you may not agree with me, but in globalization, labor lost and capital won. And so when capital won, what happened was, in places where capital was cheap but labor was high, like here, capital then began to invest in places where labor was cheap. Initially, it wasn't directly in China. Anyone who remembers what happened in the 90s, it was the maquiladoras in Mexico along the border with the US-Mexico border when these huge factories were moving over there. But eventually, as trade became more widespread and travel became easier, then global value chains began to develop, and China was in the middle of global value chains. China became like the factory of the world. And what do you need in a factory? You need resources to be able to convert that to finished products. Where did you have resources? Africa had the largest endowment of natural resources, so it made sense that China would go to Africa seeking resources. So that's one. It was just driven by what was happening in terms of the global economy. But secondly, China has always been suspicious of its presence and how it would be accepted by the rest of the world. And so China didn't simply want access to resources. China could always get access to resources on the international market. You could buy or you could buy whatever you wanted on the international market, but China wanted access at source. Right? And the Chinese suspicion was vindicated, right, with the trade war and everything. So China didn't want to have to depend on other people for material, for resources that it considered crucial to its economy. And so it wanted access to this at source. So Chinese companies went into Africa and negotiated deals with African governments for access to iron ore, gold, diamond, oil, whatever you can think about. They developed that. And for the first time, something changed. It wasn't simply that, but China offered a completely different model than the one that we had seen before. So you can, and listen, everything I'm saying here today, obviously you're free to check it out later. But recently there was a report where 101 companies either listed on the London Stock Exchange or domiciled in the UK own the rights to $1 trillion of resources in Africa. So the resources are in the ground in Africa, but ownership to these resources, right, access to these resources is for companies that are listed on the London Stock Exchange. And that's how it was done. A Western company or Chevron shows up in an African country, signs an agreement with an African government, and the way it works is we pay you in terms of royalty and taxes, and then the government was responsible to take the resources and develop its country, pay for services, pay for infrastructure. China offered a different model, resource for oil, for infrastructure deals. So basically the Chinese offer was, against payment on resources you should have, you can take out a loan and build the infrastructure you need. And up to today, Africa still lags the rest of the world on every measure of infrastructure coverage, especially with paved roads and electricity. I'll give you an example, and I always like to use this because it tells you how stark it is, that only 43% of the roads in Africa are paved, and 30% of all the paved roads in Africa are in one country, South Africa. That is the scale of the infrastructure gap on the continent. And because especially Africa south of the Sahara, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the infrastructure on which to be able to build a modern economy. Last year, well, 2017, Africa's total share of global trade was equal to South Korea, which is around 2.93%. This is a continent of about 1 billion people. And so when the Chinese show up and for the first time begin to build infrastructure that was not geared on the colonial infrastructure that most African countries inherited. The colonial infrastructure was basically the center and the periphery, and it was intended to take resources from the periphery and take it to the center. Now, in a world where regional value chains and global value chains are becoming prevalent, that's not possible in Africa because the infrastructure was not meant to connect African country to African country. It was meant to connect African country to the hosts, to the colonial, whatever. What China is doing now in terms of the infrastructure that they're building is connecting African cities, African capitals, making it possible for global value chains, regional value chains to develop. So it wasn't as if China showed up in Africa in a vacuum. It was that the relationship that most African countries had there were things missing from it. It was a bit inadequate. So after the colonial experience, of course, then we had Western companies that were coming into African countries and then negotiating. It wasn't now states, it was Western companies. And, I don't know how to say this, but the deals weren't always fair. I'll give you an example. I actually printed it out. The guy in Tanzania, Magufuli, showed up and accused Barrick Gold. So Acacia Mining, which is a division of Barrick Gold, he accused them of not paying taxes. And eventually he decided to cancel their concession agreement. He said they owed Tanzania billions of dollars. But this is what they, and the reason he raised this was in 2015, between 2010 and 2015, they paid only 8% in taxes and royalties to the government. But between those years, they paid $444 million in dividends to their shareholder while not paying any corporate income tax in Tanzania. And so when he came on, the CEO of Acacia Mining admits that the original mining agreement was not equitable. These were the kinds of agreement a lot of African countries entered into with Western firms. And so even though the resources were being mined in the country, very little was actually being paid in the country in terms of taxes to be able to finance this. And so it was the inadequacy of these relationships that made it easy for a partner like China to show up and for most African countries to just welcome the Chinese the way they did. So that was one. The second thing was just the suitability of China as a partner. One of the things that is not spoken about in terms of China in Africa is how, with the arrival of the Chinese, even contracts, civil works contracts, building roads, building power plants that are put out in terms of open tender are now increasingly won by the Chinese. And it's not because they're providing low quality works, it's just because the cost of a Chinese company doing the project is significantly lower than the cost of a European company doing the project. And I was saying to him, I was Minister of Public Works, and one of the projects we did was financed by the African Development Bank. The total cost of the project was around $70 million. That's what we knew for, it was a road project. And we had one European firm, French company, that bid, and we had about 17 Chinese companies. Right, obviously, just a law of averages, you know the winner is going to be Chinese. But the European company's bid price for a $70 million contract was $86 million. So on the day the bid was opened, you knew the European company was not going to win. But this is, and the Chinese company came in at $68.7 million in terms of being able to do that. And why? I mean, there are accusations that sometimes it's because the Chinese companies bribe African policymakers, and that is true. There are instances in which a lot of Chinese companies would win bid projects by bribing. But sometimes it's just basic project. The European company is going to mobilize with Mercedes trucks, with Scania, Volvo. Those trucks are really, really expensive to do the work. The Chinese company is going to mobilize with Howo, Sinotruck. Right? That sometimes one Mercedes truck is as expensive as 2.5 Howo trucks. Right? And so that's one. Most times when a European company mobilizes, the European company mobilizes with insurance for Europeans working there. Of course, you need insurance. They need R&R. The Chinese company, I'm not sure what the insurance structure is like for the Chinese companies, right? And so over and over, what we're seeing in civil works is that Chinese investment in terms of Chinese companies tend to be more price competitive without reducing the quality of what is produced. And I'd like to tell a story in terms of the relationship also between African governments and the Chinese government. When I was in 2008, I was very close to, a friend of mine was a part of the preparation for a delegation from Kenya to visit the US. And the Kenyan Speaker of Parliament requested a meeting with then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That was before this. I had water, anyway. And when the Kenyan delegation requested a meeting with Speaker Pelosi, they were told, I don't know if it's Speaker Pelosi herself who told them, but they were told by staff that Speaker Pelosi meets with heads of state, not speakers from Kenya. So there's that. I returned to Liberia, and in 2010, I was an aide in the president's office, just like a regular aide, guy who takes notes. And I accompanied the foreign minister of Liberia to China on a visit. It wasn't even like a state visit, it was an official visit. And we went to China, and so up to today, I don't know what the Beijing airport looks like, just because we didn't use we didn't come in like regular people. Like, we were taken off the plane from when the plane landed, and we didn't see anything until we were in our hotel room, because, it's an official delegation. There is something about how the Chinese would treat African delegations, regardless of how small the country is, in terms of how weak the country is in terms of its power, that such a treatment most African countries would not get in any European capital. But more importantly, me and the foreign minister of a small country like Liberia, by then we were like around 3.8, 3.9 million people, our foreign minister met with Xi Jinping. By then he was vice president of China, and the only reason we didn't meet with Hu Jintao was because John Kerry was visiting China and he was meeting with Hu Jintao at the same time. This was the quality of representation in terms of how the Chinese treated a small African government. If you are an African policymaker and you stand back and think about it, what about this relationship make you not embrace what the Chinese have to offer? So it was also the suitability of China as a partner, because Africa had a huge infrastructure need. China had great capacity in providing that need. Most African countries have been cut off from international financial markets. China provided the financing to be able to do this. And for the average African citizen, for the first time in a long time, they could see the direct connection between resources leaving your country and some sort of benefit, whether it was power, an airport, or a road available to you.
If you enjoy this video, don't forget to share your comments below and subscribe to our channel for more exciting videos coming up.